The Speck by T.R. Quill. It started off as a speck in a corner by the ceiling in her living room. Mary thought nothing of it at the time, dismissing it as a random dust bunny or a fleck of dirt. She merely grabbed a stepladder, took a towel to it, and moved about her business. When she noticed it the next day, though, it garnered some concern. "Is it mould?" she mused to herself aloud, grabbing the small stepladder so she could reach up to the ceiling again and lamenting internally that she wasn't tall enough to get close to the speck and examine it. Once again, using a towel, she wiped at the speck. This time she noticed a light grey residue remained. She climbed down from the stepladder and grabbed a spray bottle of Clorox. Back up she climbed, spritzing the ceiling and wiping again. "Maybe that will help," she muttered to herself as she climbed back down and put the ladder away. 2 days passed before Mary thought to look again, and it was clear that something was wrong. The speck had grown to the size of a dinner plate, and it appeared to be oozing. Grabbing the Clorox and the stepladder, she glanced up at the spot, then down to the floor. A single black blob lay on the floor. Setting the ladder against the wall, she knelt and examined the goo. She poked at it with her right index finger and spread it against her thumb. It had an almost greasy consistency, with no noticeable odour. She pulled a towel from her back pocket and quickly wiped what she could of the goo off her fingers. The same faint grey residue she had noticed from the ceiling remained on her index finger and thumb. She grabbed the ladder from the wall and set up below the spot, and, once again, climbed to spritz the Clorox at the offending oozing stain. A faint grey ring remained on the ceiling despite the bleach spray, mimicking the grey residue now on her fingers. She climbed back down the stepladder, folded it, and left it next to the wall, concluding that this may become a daily routine. She crossed the room and into the hall to navigate to the kitchen. She stopped at the sink, looking at her fingers and the daylight streaming in from the kitchen window. The grey residue seemed to mock her. Bending down, she opened the cabinet below the sink and grabbed an open bottle of Dawn dish soap. Straightening up, she mused over the bottle. Advertisements on the televisions were always showing that baby ducklings could be cleansed of oil residue after an oil spill, so she figured that it would cut right through the greasy residue on her fingers. She applied a small drop on her index finger and thumb, scrubbing in at the residue with her opposite hand and fingernails. She used an elbow to lift a handle on the sink. Water cascaded down in response. Thrusting both hands into the water, she rubbed them together vigorously to wash them, and rinsed the soap away. Turning off the water with her left hand, she examined her index finger and thumb on her right hand. The residue remained. "That's a tricky stain," she muttered to herself. She turned on the water again and applied more of the soap to her fingers. She scrubbed at them vigorously until the skin on her fingers were pink from the friction. Then she rinsed them. Leaving the water on, she looked at her right hand again. While the skin was pink, the residue persisted. She turned off the sink and stared down at her hand, trying to figure out the next step. "Well, I'll try again tomorrow," she said out loud to herself, trying to push her concern from her mind and continue about her day. That night, as she prepared for sleep, she examined her right hand again. The residue seemed to be increasing in intensity. The light grey of the residue, an almost charcoal colour now. Adjusting her night clothes, she stepped out of her bedroom and down the hall towards the living room. She flicked a light switch on the wall and the overhead light turned on. From where she stood, she could see the spot on the ceiling. Like her hand, the intensity of the spot had increased. She flicked the switch off, making a mental note to call a professional in the morning, and made her way back down the hall towards her bedroom. She climbed into bed and turned off her bedside lamp. As she slept, she dreamt of terrible things. Oozing black puddles with oily black hands and tendrils reaching out at her. Whispers in the shadows. A black figure that always seemed to be in her peripheral vision, but disappeared when she tried to look directly at it. An audible scream ripped her from her nightmares, and she jolted upright in bed. Her breathing fast and ragged, she reached over and turned on her bedside lamp. Running her left hand through her hair, she realised she was soaked in sweat. She glanced at her hands and gasped at the appearance of her right hand. Her index finger and her thumb had turned completely black, and it appeared to be spreading across her palm. A sharp pain shot through her hand and she whimpered. Clutching it with her left hand, to her horror, the impact on hand made a wet, smacking sound. She prodded at the black fingers gently to realise that she could no longer feel any sensation in them, and they had a wet, sponge-like consistency. As she lifted her left hand, she noticed they were tinged with an oily black residue, similar to the blob she had cleaned from the floor. No, 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 she muttered, terrified to herself. She ripped the bedsheets off her and lunged out of bed. Frantically, she made her way down the hall, flicking on the light as soon as she made it to the living room. The stain on the ceiling had grown, and was now larger than a manhole. Thick gobs of black, greasy liquid seeped from the spot and fell onto the floor with an audible thud. She watched as another black blob descended from the ceiling, the audible thwack as it hit the floor, making her gag. Instinctively, she covered her mouth with her right hand and realised her mistake a moment too late. As the spongy fingers made contact with her face, she felt the greasy liquid smear across her cheek. A cry of desperation escaped her. "Think, Mary, think!" she mumbled to herself, trying to clear her head. The hospital, she thought. The emergency room, perhaps. She made her way back to her bedroom, slid her feet into a pair of sandals, and made to reach for her purse and keys. "Stay!" The whisper caught her by surprise. She let out a small scream. She turned full circle, looking for the source, looking back at her keys, and she shook her head. You're losing it, Mary. You're cracking up." She took a deep breath and reached for her keys and purse once more. "Stay!" The whisper came again, louder and with an angry intensity that made Mary shudder. She dropped her keys. "Who's there?" she asked loudly towards the dark hallway. She was met with silence. She knelt and picked up the keys, expecting the whisper this time. "Stay!" "Who's there?" she hollered back at it, fear and frustration mounting. She waited another moment, expecting more silence. Instead, a sound much like a wet footstep came down the hall. Mary stared in scared silence. Another wet footstep followed a minute later. If she wanted to leave, she should have gone down the hall. If she wanted to leave, she would have to run into whatever was walking towards her bedroom. If she stayed where she was, it would eventually come to her. "What do you want?" Her voice came in a thin, scared yell. More silence. Another step. A single teardrop escaped her eye and dripped down her cheek. She wiped at it absent-mindedly with the back of her hand. Glancing down, what should have been a clear wet smear on the back of her hand was black and greasy. Another step. It was closing in on her, and she felt like a caged animal. She looked at her bedroom window, her reflection showing a black blossom across one cheek and a black smear down another. She crossed the room quickly, keys still in hand, and opened the window. "We said stay!" The whisper was louder, closer. Mary did her best to ignore it as she reached up with both hands to climb out the window. Her right hand failed her, the spongy consistency causing the fingers to slice open with the pressure and contact with the window frame. Black ooze seeped down the wall from the wounds in her fingers. She clutched at the window opening, sobbing now, frantic to escape whatever unknown horror waited behind her, but failing to find the strength to make the climb. She didn't realise the footsteps had stopped. A black, tentacle-like tendril slipped over her right shoulder, plunging her side in an icy cold. She watched in horror as it wrapped her hand and snapped off the dead, black fingers. Mary screamed, whirling around and coming face to face with the black, faceless figure. Another tendril reached for her face as she slapped it away with her left hand, an animalistic shriek escaping her. Another tendril quickly manifested in its place and stretched towards her cheek. The same ice-cold glacier feeling flooded her face. Why are you doing this to me? She asked the figure in a choked sob. Another tendril wrapped round her throat as if in response, and her breath became laboured as it squeezed. She stared at the black, faceless head of the figure, her vision narrowing, darkness creeping in. Mary's body went limp as she lost consciousness and slid to the floor. The whirring of machines and a steady beeping noise met her ears. Mary opened her eyes to a harsh, bright light and winced. She brought a hand to cover her eyes and was surprised to find an IV attached to it. Sitting up slowly, she groaned and clutched at her aching head. "Oh good, you're awake." Mary looked up to find the face of a friendly nurse smiling at her. "I'll get the doctor." Minutes passed and Mary took in the surrounding hospital room. An oxygen machine sat next to her, its air passing through the tubes that were connected across her face, feeding her air through her nose. The IV slowly dripped fluids into her body while a monitor beeped with the rhythm of her heartbeat. A doctor walked into the room, his mouth twisted up in a smile that didn't quite reach his blue eyes. "Hey, I'm glad to see you're awake." He reached out with a hand to shake Mary's, but let it fall when she didn't move. I'm Dr. Smith. I've been overseeing your care while you've been unconscious. Now, if you're up for the task, I have got a few questions I need to go over with you." He pulled a swivel chair close to the bed she sat in. "Where am I?" Mary rasped. She clutched at her throat, remembering the feeling of having her airways cut off. Alarmed, she held up both hands to examine them. All 10 fingers were accounted for. The doctor watched her, his brow furrowed. "You're at St. Bonaventure's Hospital. Can I have you state your name and your date of birth for verification purposes?" How did I get here? Please, before I answer any other questions, your name and your date of birth for verification. Mary Hauser, September 8th, 1982. The doctor scribbled a note onto a clipboard he was holding. "You arrived at our hospital via ambulance 2 days ago. You were unconscious at the time of arrival, and a neighbour escorted you during transport. Can you tell me anything that you remember prior to falling unconscious?" "Well, there was this big black thing in the house. I couldn't get rid of it. It just kept growing. Look, I know I sound crazy, but it attacked me." Dr. Smith quickly scribbled another note on his clipboard. "I don't know that I've ever heard of black mold attacking anyone. But it certainly makes more sense now. Your COPD puts you at more risk with black mold. We'll have to run a few more tests to make sure that you're on the mend. We need to hold you for a few more days." Black mold? Mary looked at the doctor, trying to let his words sink in. Had it all been an illusion? "The important thing right now is that you rest," the doctor said, standing up and moving towards the door. "Let us do the work." He opened the door and looked back at her. Oh, and Mary, she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, doctor?" A malicious smile spread across his face, his eyes darkening.
Stay!